My name is Shelley Ambrose. I'm the Executive Director of the Walrus, and we are my fan club. Look at that. You're going with me everywhere. We're thrilled to be here at the Phi Center, and we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded Indigenous lands of the traditional territory of both the Kanean, Kahaka, Mohawk, and the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. Montreal has long been a meeting place for diverse First Nations, and we're honored to continue a long tradition of conversation on this very spot. And we're thrilled to be here in Montreal with you. We know that time is actually your greatest non-renewable resource, and so we are awfully chuffed that you choose to spend some of your time with us. So thank you for coming. The Walrus started 16 years ago, and it's an optimistic project. It's meant to foster conversation across Canada, and we recognize that these conversations are both necessary and complex, and so they take many forms at the Walrus. We create conversations through fact-based journalism at the Walrus. We didn't used to have to say fact-based journalism. We used to just say journalism, but we can't do that anymore. We do that by publishing journalism daily at thewalrus.ca. We publish the Walrus books, and we convene interested and interesting people like you in rooms like this across the country for the Walrus Talks. So no matter where the Walrus is or how it is consumed, we embrace our commitment to be independent and to convene groups who care about the issues that matter. So thank you for joining us and for supporting this commitment. Hands up if you read the Walrus. Thank you for that. Hands up if you subscribe or donate and support us financially. You are my favorite people. All of you right there. I'm going to buy you a drink after. Come and find me at the reception. Hands up if you've been to a talks before. Welcome back. And hands up if you're new. It's time to welcome all these new people, old people. That's fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Any former Walrus talkers in the room? I see one right there. Hello, Stephen Huddart. Okay. So I want to thank CIFAR for making this event possible. We're very grateful for the support of all of these conversations. And we're very excited to tonight have the second of a series of 4 talks that we are doing with CIFAR. And CIFAR, if you don't know, is a Canadian-based global charitable organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. CIFAR's community of fellows includes, this is incredible, 20 Nobel laureates and more than 400 researchers from 22 countries. In 2017, the Government of Canada appointed CIFAR to develop and lead the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy, which is the world's first national AI strategy. So to tell us a little bit more about CIFAR's research, we have with us the President and CEO of CIFAR. He is recognized as a leader in health research, science policy, mentorship, and organizational leadership. Since becoming CIFAR's president in 2012, the organization has grown substantially, launching 2 global calls for ideas, the CIFAR Israeli Global Scholars Program for early career investigators, as well as expanding the delivery of knowledge mobilization and public engagement activities, and in his spare time, moving their offices to the Mars Discovery District in Toronto. Please welcome Dr. Alan Bernstein.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très heureux d'être ici à Montréal, au Center Phi. I've never been to this gallery, actually. I think we should all have the gallery opened up afterwards so we can look at the artwork. So I'm very pleased to be here with all of you this evening. And thank you, Shelley, for your introduction. And merci beaucoup à l'équipe Walrus for your continued partnership in this series, which I think has just been a fantastic series so far. This is the second of 4 events that we're doing together with the Walrus, and they kind of align somewhat with the 4 broad themes at CIFAR: individuals and society, life and health, earth and space, and information and matter. Our first event was in Ottawa on boundaries, and it was an interesting topic, interesting evening, because there was talks about boundaries between people, between countries, and between life and death. So think about that. Walrus' mission is to provoke new thinking. You talked about CIFAR, so I'll talk about Walrus. Walrus' mission is to provoke new thinking and spark conversation on matters that are vital to Canadians. CIFAR's mission is to convene extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. So it's kind of a natural marriage between our two organizations, I think, that we're working together on these great evenings. We were founded in 1982 on a kind of disarmingly simple idea, which is if you want to make progress on important questions, bring together the very best people you can find from anywhere in the world, regardless of what discipline they're working on, and put them together in a room to develop a global community of trust and of top people. So with that vision, not constrained by disciplinary boundaries, geographic borders, we nourish the exploration of bold ideas, risk-taking, and transformative knowledge sharing. Importantly, actually, that model works. So over the last 37 years, CIFAR has been a catalyst for many, many landmark advances, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the importance of a child's early years, which you'll hear somewhat tonight, I think, and in the socioeconomic determinants of health. The revolution in AI, which we all read about daily, started at CIFAR and was made possible because of that environment of risk-taking and bold thinking that we foster. Indeed, here in Montreal, Montreal stands as one of the world's vibrant centers in AI and has been very much a partnership between CIFAR, the Université de Montréal, and McGill Universities, and MILA, the AI Institute that we help fund here in Montreal. Joshua Bengio, who many of you will know or know of, is a CIFAR Fellow and co-directs CIFAR's program in Learning in Machines and Brains. Indeed, Joshua and I were on a panel earlier today downtown, or maybe we're downtown now. And through CIFAR's pan-Canadian AI strategy, what the federal government funded 2 years ago, we fund Mila, Vector in Toronto, and AMI in Edmonton. We've created so far 46 Canada CIFAR chairs in AI, half of whom are really top AI scientists who we've recruited to Canada, and we'll be announcing another 40 shortly. Our community of fellows, advisors, global scholars, and AI chairs now includes, as you just heard from Shelley, 20 Nobel laureates and more than 400 researchers from 23 countries, including the Canadian recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physics, Jim Peebles. The talks you're going to hear tonight all center around the theme of survival, how life, in its many and varied forms, continues to adapt despite challenging and changing circumstances. Three of the speakers, Vladis Ameksevich, Brett Finley, and Kieran O'Donnell, are fellows in 3 different CIFAR programs. Earth 4D, that had its actually very first meeting earlier this week, Humans in the Microbiome, and Child and Brain Development. We'll hear a variety of perspectives on that theme of survival, from the prospect of life surviving the frigid cold and fierce radiation on Mars, how a mother's mood affects the child, and how modern medicine can survive a world where bacteria have developed resistance to our medications. I'm also excited to hear perspectives on survival in the cultural and political spheres this evening. While the word survival connotes sort of the threats of endangered life, I hope that tonight's message will also actually be about diversity and resilience and the robustness of life. Otherwise, we all wouldn't be here, of course. I know that tonight's presentations will be really thought-provoking, educational, and entertaining. And I hope you'll take advantage of the reception afterwards back there to corner the speakers and have conversations with them. We'll also have a table at the reception where you can learn more about CIFAR, our important work on advancing knowledge, nurturing the careers of the world's most outstanding young investigators, and mobilize that knowledge to improve the world. Thank you for coming out on a wet night, and I hope you enjoy tonight's very stimulating conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I can't believe 1982 was 37 years ago. Feels like yesterday, seriously. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone here with a connection to CIFAR. Tonight is our 122nd Walrus Talks across the country on every topic that you can imagine. So for the new people, this is how the Walrus Talks works. We keep the lights up. You have a program in your hand, you should, that looks like this. Please keep it and follow along. Speaker order is on the front. The talkers' bios are on the back. I will not be standing up and reading the program to you. I don't pop up like a jack-in-the-box in between each speaker and go on and on about them. No, they will introduce themselves. You will see and hear 7 talkers in a row. They each have 7 minutes. They know this. It's clear. 7 talkers, 7 minutes each in a row, and then afterwards we will have a lot to talk about at the post-talks reception. So just before I let them get underway, I'd like to thank each in advance. So thank you to Earth and planetary scientists at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and CIFAR fellow Vlada Stomenkonovich. Thank you to Research and Evaluations Manager at Apathy is Boring, Samantha Roosh. Thank you to microbiologist at the University of British Columbia and co-director of CIFAR's Humans and the Microbiome Program, B. Brett Finley. Thank you to developmental psychobiologist at McGill University and CIFAR fellow, Kieran O'Donnell. Thank you to best-selling author, Cherie Demeline. Thank you to climate scientist at Concordia University, Damon Matthews. And thank you to Director of Programming, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Daviani Saltzman. Thank you for coming. Let us begin.
Let's do this. Bonsoir, Montréal. Welcome, everybody. So, my name is Vlada Stomenkovic. I'm from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And let me ask you first how you feel. Warm? Good? Well, let's do a thought experiment. Let's go out together. The way you are right now. It's a bit cold, right? And I'm from Southern California. For me, it's quite cold. So let's go out. We put all the, the warming effects of sheep that we can have, put it around us. And let's do a thought experiment. Let's reduce the temperature to about minus 60 degrees Celsius. Still feeling good? Let's have some swings going down to minus 130 degrees Celsius. Well, a little bit more chilly now, huh? Let's change the atmosphere and throw in all CO2. Then let's reduce the pressure by about a factor of 160 to about 6 millibar. How are we feeling now? Let's stop this. Let's bathe in wonderful ionizing radiation, UV, and in really strong oxidants. So, what I can say right now is welcome to Mars. To be precise, welcome to the Martian surface. Now, the interesting thing is, we knew that already actually, that the Martian surface is maybe in some ways quite inhospitable to life, as my doctor says, because of its conditions. We knew it already in 1976, when we had Viking 1 and Viking 2, 2 landers landing on Mars. However, at that time, people thought, oh, well, the surface is really bad for life, so there is no life anywhere on Mars, right? That's the conclusion. However, at that time, we didn't know one thing. We didn't know what's happening beneath our own feet, here on the Earth. Let's continue our thought experiment. What do you see around you? Look around. Just be frank. Look around. Try it. Come on. You see people. You see trees. You see lamps. You see, your neighbors sometimes, if you have to. So you see all life that you experience. All life we know is happening on the surface, right? I call it the surface boundary layer phenomenon. But as many times, we live in a little bubble, socially, but also from our understanding. And when we live in a little bubble, we often lack a deeper understanding of everything around us. And in my context, deeper has not just a metaphoric meaning, but actually a literal meaning. Because what we lack is understanding what's beneath our feet. There's not just a dead ball of rock beneath us. There's a huge, vast volume of rock and water, liquid water. Those together create nutrients, create hydrogen, methane, things that bugs eat. They create life in the deep subsurface. Wherever we drill, kilometers deep, here in Canadian Shields or in South Africa, we find life. It's not as Jules Verne imagined it, big and interesting. It's still interesting, but not big. It's mostly microbes. They live slowly. There's not many of them, but they're there, and they thrive in the deep grounds. So that's what we're trying to do with actually Earth 4D in the CIFAR program. We're exploring life under our feet and resources, volatiles, and trying to understand what the subsurface bears to understand life beyond the Earth and for our own society. So, but what does it mean now for Mars? Well, it means that there might be actually life hiding in the Martian deep subsurface at similar depths of a few kilometers where liquid water could exist on Mars today. It's plausible, it's possible, it's there. Honestly, we don't know because we haven't really explored it yet. We don't have the data, and data rules at the end. So, is there something we can do about this? Yes, we can, and we're doing something about that. By the way, yes, we can is a good slogan, remember that. So, what we're doing right now, actually, at JPL, is we've been developing an instrument for the last 2 years, and I've been very fortunate to lead those efforts. The instrument is called THOR, T-H-2-O-R. It stands for Transmissive H2O Reconnaissance. And what it does is it uses electromagnetic waves in order to sound liquid water at large depths. And by not just finding out if there is liquid water, we also try to find out what this water is made of, what its chemistry is. And that's really important because once you understand there is liquid water in the ground and what its chemistry is, then we can start to think what kind of life could be there and whether life could be there. And that's the next step that we have to take. Now, wonderful. So, we see now maybe there's life in the Martian subsurface. We have a way to explore it. We have an instrument developing for this. But what does it mean for us here on the Earth? Well, in one hand, I think it's quite awesome. That's a very American word, but, there we go, Southern California. It's really, I think, very awesome to think about if there is life out there. I do believe and think that if we find evidence of life somewhere else, that it will very profoundly affect our life here in the world, even if we find no evidence. It will change us in many ways. It will hopefully make us more humble and ground us more, and at the same time make us a bit more noble to see beyond, to explore. So we could just stop here. However, we have problems on our own planet that are much more, grounded problems. And it's called thirst. And I'm not talking about the thirst for that, delicious cocktail or the second cup of decaf latte macchiato, which is, of course, legit. But I'm talking about real thirst. People on this planet, near and far, near as well, are actually thirsty. They don't have access to clean drinking water. And that's a big problem because, we all like water. It's essential for life as we know it. So what we're doing is by developing an instrument that's going to search for liquid water in the Martian subsurface, we're also developing a very simple tool that's not as advanced as all the really great instruments that we have already on our planet to search for water. But it's much cheaper, much simpler, and it can be, you can use small smartphone apps, that means any kid can use it, to actually explore if there is liquid water, drinkable liquid water, in your vicinity. And what we're trying to do is, on one hand, search for signs of life on Mars and beyond, and use the same technology to help our communities here in the world to have access to drinking water and survive. Right now, we're at a spot where we are in a spot where we can actually access some really important knowledge. We can go to Mars, we can search for signs of life, and maybe it's too late for David Bowie, who asked the question, is there life on Mars, to hear the answer, but it's not too late for us. We can find out if there is actually life in the Martian subsurface in the next decade. And we can also use that technology to help people here on the planet find water and survive. And combining, therefore, how to survive Mars to surviving here on our own planet. And together, elevate surviving to actually living. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Good evening. Hi, my name is Samantha Roosh, and I'm the Research and Evaluations Manager at Apathy is Boring. So, The best argument against democracy, or so the saying goes, is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. This quote is quite popular, and not just because Winston Churchill maybe did, but also possibly didn't actually say it. I'm sure many of you have heard it, seen it, and you've maybe even shared it. Even if you haven't, as someone who's engaged in this work, I have to tell you, the sentiment is common, especially during elections. It pops up in memes, with snarky e-pundits on Twitter, and even in national news broadcasts. At Apathy is Boring, we work year-round to engage young people, our peers, in Canada's democracy. We believe principally in seeking out the voices of less engaged and less experienced youth and supporting them to join the conversation on issues that are important to them. As you might imagine, I don't love that quote, but I can't ignore that its popularity hints at a core issue with the way we collectively seem to think our democracy should work. The biggest problem, or so says the quote, is not, say, the degree to which a conversation about our political systems could potentially be inaccessible to the average voter, but rather the inconvenience we cause when we do try to engage with them. So I'd like to challenge the premise at the center of this issue. Why does the average voter only get 5 minutes? We tend to think of our democracy as a great equalizer, but a closer inspection reveals that actually it does a remarkably good job at replicating and perpetuating the inequities already deeply embedded in our society. Democracy and our electoral system has been used as justification for generations of oppression and violence, for colonialism, and for the exploitation of resources, peoples, and land. This manifests politically in whose voices are given disproportionate weight within decision-making processes, and within media, and within our broader narratives and conversations. Whose concerns and priorities are held up and given legitimacy? Whose are dismissed as inconsequential? And who is being told implicitly or explicitly, repeatedly, and sometimes violently, that their voice and their experience is not welcome, even for 5 minutes? Believe it or not, we do not come into this world prepared to engage in our political system. It takes time and education and mentorship to develop the required skills and knowledge. It takes networking and it takes connections. Young people here in Canada have been slowly withdrawing from our electoral system for the last 50 years. This is true across all Western democracies, in fact. And the decline is particularly pronounced in communities who face additional barriers, such as education and poverty and discrimination. While we won't know the voter turnout among young people in this most recent election for another few months, I can tell you that in the new class of MPs elected to the House of Commons, only about 50 of the 338 are under the age of 40. This is despite millennials and Gen Z being the largest segment of the voting population in this election. People like to speak often and loudly about how young people don't care, but 500,000 young people and their allies marching in the streets of Montreal this September for climate seem to suggest there's more to the story. We see every day in our work how young people are engaged by issues but often have few channels and limited power to have an impact on them. Research tells us that young people are actually neurologically hardwired for innovation. Young people will create new channels to have our voices heard when the old ones fail us. Channels that are not within the formal boundaries of our political systems, but instead outside, seeking to build influence and power to create impacts in other ways. Large-scale social movements, protests, creative activations, organizing, and community building are only a few ways young people engage, but few of us are actually entering into the halls of formal political power. We're at a pivotal moment for the survival of democracy on a global scale. Citizens feel a certain urgency and impatience with the ability of democracy to effectively respond to the greatest challenges of our time: inequality, poverty, climate injustice. As we become increasingly disengaged from the system and power becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few, who is investing their time in our average voter? What about our average non-voter? Now's not the time to shut each other out, but rather to take the time to engage each other. Maybe even especially when it's hard. Democracy is a tool, it's a process. Like any process, we get out of it what we put in. How can we ensure that this generation of leaders are ready to engage within this system? We need a movement towards youth-led democratic innovation. We need to acknowledge the power and knowledge held by young people and held by our average voters. We need new solutions, and we need fresh eyes if we have any hope to solve our biggest challenges, especially the ones that create barriers to our democratic ideals. We need those most impacted leading the way. Only then can we ensure that our democracy can effectively take care of and advocate on behalf of all those who make their homes here. This work is not just done during elections, but essentially between them as well. So I'm going to leave you with a different quote, and one that I like a lot more, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better, and hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. Our democracy doesn't need passive optimism, it needs hope and it needs hard work. It needs active and sustained investment in each other and in our collective future. Democracy starts locally. It starts with the way we treat each other, with how we engage each other around the issues in our communities. It starts with questions, and it cooperates to build collective answers and compromise. It takes patience and it takes listening, but most importantly, it takes more than 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. Can I have the first slide? Oh, timer started already. Great. So I'm Brett Finley. I'm a professor of microbiology and biochemistry at the University of British Columbia. I'm also co-director of a program on humans and microbes. And I've studied diarrhea all my life, so I love feces, so this talk is restricted for fecals. So, microbes. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek discovered him over 300 years ago when he built the first microscope. And one of the things he did is he swabbed out his mouth, held it up to the light, and saw all these animalcules. And he made this most stunning statement: there's more microbes in his mouth than people living in the Netherlands, which is where he lived. Microbiology was born. What do we do with that information? Nothing. So basically, we knew they were there, we didn't know what they do. So I want to continue Vlad's thought experiment where he makes you look around the room. Look around the room, what do you see? A bunch of people, right? Wrong. I see a bunch of Homo sapiens. They're just coated in microbes. There's more microbes in and on you than there are human cells in and on you. They contain 100 times more genetic material than you have of Homo sapiens DNA in you. So I love to tell my students you're more microbe than human. That really pisses them off. We know this because we've been able to start to sequence of things. So let's go back a bit more to what do these things do? So the last decade has just seen a profound explosion in the realization these microbes actually do something for us. We now realize that they affect how the brain develops, how the gut develops, how the immune system develops. Most of the food you eat, you can't digest. You leave it up to your microbes because they're in your gut anyway. They produce essential vitamins. You cannot live without these things. So we call this, we now realize we're what we call a holobiont or a symbiont kind of thing of this collection of microbes and us. And this really drives philosophers nuts when I'll say, what is it to be human? So we ask this, and I say, what about all those microbes living on you? Are they part of you? And their brain just goes, and then we change the subject. So going back to history again, about 125 years ago, two very famous microbiologists, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, basically showed that microbes cause disease, the germs. And this is a huge step forward because they didn't know what was causing plague and cholera and things. Then Pasteur took it a step further. He boiled these things, he cooked them, he pasteurized them. And then if you kill them, you don't get disease. So if microbes cause disease and killing prevents disease, what do? We kill microbes. And that's what we did. We got antibiotics, vaccines, sanitation, we cleaned up the sewers and everything. Yay! In the last 50 years, infectious diseases have really gone down in our society. They're not the problem they were. Great. But look at the right-hand side of this curve. That's the diseases of today's society: obesity, asthma, IBD, all these other diseases we see that we currently face. And it turns out that in our quest to get all these bad microbes, we also got rid of the good ones. And ironically, all those diseases on the right are now being tied to microbes and their role in these things, in our change in society. So here's my favorite topic, fecal transfers. Don't dial this number, but anyway. So I want to show you that microbes can actually be used to cure diseases. So Clostridium difficile, which is an infection well known in Quebec, caused by antibiotics. Antibiotics don't fix it, but if you have a fecal transfer from a healthy person, you've got an over 90% cure rate to an otherwise very serious and potentially lethal disease, just by poop from a good person or a well person into a sick person. So we're starting to exploit these microbes for the benefits of these things too. So our group has really been engaging in some very interesting thought processes, and these are kind of the areas we're sort of focusing on now. First of all, what I call the bookends of life, early and late life. This is where the microbes change the most and seem to have the biggest effect. For example, if you're born by a C-section, you have a 25% higher rate of getting asthma and a 30% higher rate of becoming obese, just by how you stick your head in this world. So I love to say, the best birthday present a mother can ever give her kid is that very first one, a big bolus of fecal and vaginal microbes. Yay. Gross as heck, but the kids need these things. This helps them develop. The other end of life, so healthy aging. We now know microbes play a major role in this. And for example, if you take the top 10 reasons why the average Canadian dies, number 8 is bacterial or microbial, that's pneumonia and influenza. We now know that 9 of those other 10 reasons are actually microbes related to. I don't have reason and time to show you all this. I actually wrote a book with my daughter, who's a gerontologist, on how to age with your microbes, if you're interested in this more. But they're finding amazing effects in there. Then we realize we live in a community, right? So you shake hands with people, you share houses, you share other things with these things. Turns out we have this community microbiome. This actually impacts you. If you have an obese friend, you have 57% higher chance of being obese. If you have IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, your spouse has a much higher chance of getting that disease. It's not genetic, and we have a lot of interesting things now that maybe these are microbes. So, okay, it's us and our microbes. How do we figure out how we can look at this and what are we going to do for the future? So some of our members, including Heinrich Poiner here, studies ancient microbes. So this is a body from Troy. It's not Helen, but it was a woman that died of disease there. We were able to sequence the microbes, show what she died of. But more neater, he studies Roman latrines and Viking latrines, and this is 9,000-year-old poop. You think you eat a lot of fiber? Check that out. We can sequence these microbes. Great, we know what they are, but you can then line them up to when plague comes through, for example. And you can see how the microbes change in these things. And are the microbes adapting quickly? So the tenet I want to really get at is these things can change really, really quickly. If you go on a diet, your microbes will change by tomorrow. So they're adaptively genetic. We can't change as a Homo sapiens for a long time, many generations. So this gives you this real genetic flexibility. These microbes bequeath on us, and they're just part of us. And so there's all sorts of interesting possibilities of how these things can affect our survival. So I'll leave with you a thought that, well, here's a lovely thought. If you take a gram of feces, which is about the size of your little finger, piece of poo, that contains more microbes than the entire population of humans in this earth. So think of the genocide you commit every time you go to the washroom. But besides that, microbes are part of us, and I think this realization in the last decade that they're just part of us is what they do. This is part of our life. Every multicellular organism has these microbes, and they influence the adaptability of these things to basically live in this world as it changes. So climate change, all these other changes, microbes are changing, and if we figure this out, hopefully that can help us to live with these microbes for our benefit. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and microbes. My name is Kieran O'Donnell, and I'm an assistant professor of epigenetics and epidemiology at McGill University and a CIFAR fellow in the Child and Brain Development Program. So I learned tonight that CIFAR and I were both born in the same year, which makes us both millennials, and I hope we can coordinate our birthday parties from here on in. It'll be an interesting evening. So 7 minutes to talk about survival. 7 minutes. Doesn't seem like a long time. 6 minutes, 30 seconds, even less. Well, perhaps I don't need 6 minutes. Perhaps all I need is the next minute or so. And in fact, if you remember nothing else from the next 6 minutes, if you just remember the next simple numbers, then I'll be pretty happy. because these are the numbers that I think are key to our survival. In fact, I don't just think that they're key to our survival as a society, I think they're key to us thriving as a society. So what are these relatively simple numbers that fascinate me and frustrate me in equal measure? And I hope you leave the room being frustrated by them too. Well, they're pretty simple. This isn't big data, but these are small numbers that can have a big influence. So 1 in 4, 8, and 14. 1 in 4, 8, and 14. So 1 in 4 represents the number of women that will struggle with their mental health in pregnancy or in the postnatal period. 1 in 4. Now, when I look around my friends and my family, that number holds true. And I think that if you were to look around your friends and your family and you were to ask about people's experience, those numbers would hold true too. 1 in 4. So what about 8 and 14? Well, 8 and 14 represents 8 billion pounds and 14 billion US dollars. That represents the cost per year for not treating maternal mental health in the perinatal period. And we hear a lot about postpartum depression. We know that antenatal depression is just as common. Anxiety is common in the prenatal period as well as in the postnatal period. 8 billion pounds per year for annual cohort of live births. This was a cost estimate derived in part from data that we generated while working in the UK with a cohort of over 15,000 pregnancies. And 14 billion US dollars is a cost estimate that was derived just last year. But what I find remarkable about these numbers is that in the UK, 72%, almost 3/4 of the costs associated with not treating perinatal mental health problems is derived from the adverse effects on child outcomes. So whether it be being born smaller or lighter, whether it be child neurodevelopment, or indeed our own work on mental health, approximately 72% of those costs are derived from the adverse effects on the child. Now, while looking at this, you might just think, well, what about the US? Well, in the US, it's 40% of those costs are derived from the adverse effects on child outcomes. And for those of you that are very astute, you'll think, well, aha, what about the US having a 3 times the increased birth rate per year? Why isn't it even more expensive or more costly in the US? Well, that cost estimate is only derived from the costs of perinatal mental health on outcomes from birth to 5 years of age, whereas in the United Kingdom, it was from birth to 18 years of age. So I think you can see quite clearly as we go from 5 years to 10 years to 15 years to 20 years, how these costs are going to quickly add up. So you might ask yourself, well, why and how is it that maternal mental health, maternal mood in pregnancy can have such profound and lasting effects on child development? And that's a question that really drives my research program forward and fascinates me. And I think it requires us to take a step back and think about the marvel that is fetal neurodevelopment. Think about those 250,000 neurons that are added almost every minute. Think about the 17-fold increased brain volume that we see from mid-gestation to birth, and then around a 4-fold increase growth from birth to 5 years of age. And even really interesting work showing that from around 32 weeks of pregnancy, that the fetus responds differently to an audio playback of the mother versus a stranger. And there's a bit of a time lag to that change in the fetal heart rate, suggesting some level of cognitive processing. And indeed our own work, working with the ALSPAC cohort in the UK, 15,000 pregnant women, where we see children have approximately twice the risk for mental health problems. And we see this as early as age 4, and it persists until at least age 15. In fact, follow-up analyses have suggested that this can last into at least early adulthood. And this is when we control for a whole bunch of confounding factors, including postnatal factors, socioeconomic status, and those other risk factors, including substance use, that you might think would have such a profound and lasting effect on child development. In fact, in this cohort, maternal mental health in pregnancy was a more significant or a stronger predictor of child mental health than smoking or alcohol use in that particular cohort. But one of the things that fascinates me about this research area is that we still don't know which child is going to be affected. In fact, children can be affected in very different ways. And so what we're doing in our research program, and really a question that we tackle in the Child and Brain Development Program as part of CIFAR, is trying to understand that biological embedding of experience. How does that experience in the womb get under the skin? And we're focusing on biochemical changes to the DNA, so-called epigenetic changes, to better understand those individual differences in the effects of the early environment on child outcome. Now, one of the things that frustrates me about those numbers that I showed you earlier on is that we don't have good evidence from Canadian cohorts. And that's why we're building an evidence base here in Montreal and partnering with cohorts across Canada to try and build a strong case for increased investment in maternal perinatal mental health, to try and reduce those already small numbers, 1 in 4, 8, 14. And I think if we can invest in maternal mental health, we really stand to benefit not only the woman's mental health, but also that of her child. And I'll leave you with this quote, which I think sums it all up. And that is that if we change the beginning of the story, we change the whole story. Thank you.
Ani Bojo. My name is Cherie Demeline, but the old women in my community have given me a different name, and that is She Listens to Her People. It's that I can remember who I am and what my job is, and that is to carry stories. I belong to the rolling white sands around the southern Georgian Bay, and to my grandmothers who came there from the Red River, from Drummond Island, and from what was known as Indian Territory down into Wisconsin. I belong to the people I am charged with listening to. And the last time I was asked to give a Walrus speech, the topic was success. And in thinking about this one on survival, it occurred to me that they were almost the same thing in my mind. As an Indigenous person, survival is success. And sometimes that can be uplifting, and other times that's kind of depressing, right? Is that the best we can hope for? Just survival? So I needed to understand just what I meant by survival. Did I mean breathing, being allowed to participate in life as a human, the mere act of being alive? No, that wasn't it. When I think about survival, I think about the question that brought my community through 3 forced relocations to our present settlement. The question that ensured my ancestors, my grandparents, and my parents gave me everything I would need to thrive as both a person who, by my definition, participates in life, and as a Métis woman. That question being, who do we want to be at the moment of our survival? When we arrive at survival, who exactly are we going to be that ensures the success of that initial achievement? In writing my book, The Marrow Thieves, and now working on the television series, I was telling a story from inside an apocalypse. And I could do this with absolute certainty in its viability because as Indigenous people, we have already survived the apocalypse. I was writing a dystopian future based on a dystopian past. It's basically the story of the reemergence of residential schools built to hold and experiment on Indigenous people to study and extract their ability to dream, even in the midst of terror. It is the very story of how you survive by carrying everything that you need with you, within the stories you tell, the people you fight alongside, the ways you mourn, and the ways you celebrate. And this book is a prayer for everything we have been and all the ways we continue on. And so even dystopian in tone, it's very hopeful. When I wrote my new book, Empire of Wild, I wanted to address many issues: resource extraction, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, land claims, rights erasure. And it revolves around a creature from Métis communities, the Rougarou. It asks the question, what happens when colonization looks away from our land and our children? And what happens when it comes for our gods? And what are the ways in which they will resist? More than anything, though, I wanted to talk about the heaviest weight that we carry, the absolute heft of beauty and joy. The burden we can't put down for even a moment because it's so intricately tied to our struggle and we cannot live without them. It is a celebration of the feat of being able to bring with us the ability to laugh and love each other and bring our whole hearts into the work of ceremony and struggle, and doing that through our own worldview and on our own terms. Because survival is only truly successful when we can see with our own eyes and measure with our own tools who and what we are. This is true resistance. Anything else is just assimilation and breathing. Not real survival at all. Instead, we survive as a people so that we may live as a people. And I'm often confronted by people who really want to share their opinions with me on Indigenous people and issues, thanks social media. They offer up what they call facts on Indigenous poverty, addiction, and corruption. But what is missing from any of this thought is rigor, the understanding that if your community was in the midst of a fight for survival, one that had been going on for over 400 years, you might just see more broken veterans on the street as well. You might just find those fighting are angry and disillusioned and sometimes in need of support. They have this impression that we need to get over something that happened hundreds of years ago, to which, of course, I ask, when exactly they assume it ever ended. If we live in a post-colonial world, when and where exactly was the finish line between ongoing and post? I really think we probably should have been invited to that after party. And so then this too enters the narrative when we talk about survival, the most basic understanding that we exist and thrive and struggle and triumph and fall within an ongoing state of oppression. Our survival is every day, every minute, right now. And how can the world at this moment of crisis and potential destruction learn from our struggle? Let's consider a scenario. Let's assume for a moment that we were all on a boat that is very clearly falling apart. The engine has stopped and is billowing smoke. The rivets are loose and pinging to the bottom of the hull like popcorn. We're taking on water in fate-sealing amounts. So what do? We turn to the engineers that built the failing vessel and we ask them, can you secure our survival? Well, they only have this design, this failing design that has brought us to this point. Instead, maybe we should turn to those passengers, few as they have become since we've forgotten to provide them with, let's say, clean drinking water. We turn to them who understand the sea that we are sinking into. Those who have the knowledge to navigate the waters and feed us from them. Those who know exactly how to survive every day, every minute, right now. At some point, we might want to consider the option that can do the dual work of allowing our veterans a moment of peace away from the constant fight, and one that brings us all back to shore, turning to Indigenous knowledge as a way forward. And what I'm suggesting is not staggering, it's not an impossibility, it begins with listening to those who have answers. It begins with allowing people to live on their own lands and take over the steering wheel for a bit, at least when it comes to their own paths, out from underneath oppressive and racist legislation. It means understanding that, like our stories, we need to look back and mourn, to look forward with hope, to resist on our own terms and celebrate all the beauty in the struggle. Because when we are out there on the sea together at that moment, the rusted hulk of a failing ship slides towards the bottom, we can choose to sink with it into the dark, or we can float on our backs and see every point of light in the stars. And if we do it right, we'll be floating alongside those who know how to read the stars. And then we will all be together in a story that belongs to this land the same way I belong to my land. And out there, with our eyes on the original instructions, we will find the strongest form of success we could ever hope for. We will find more than just the shore. We will find survival. Chimigwech.
My name is Damon Matthews. So here's my question. Will climate change mean the end of humanity? So I'll start by rephrasing this in a slightly more scientific and cagey manner. So how about, could climate change mean the end of humanity? Or even better, what is the likelihood that climate change could mean the end of humanity? So there's a question for you, and here's my definitive answer, informed by all of the climate science expertise I can lay claim to. It depends. So as a climate scientist, I regularly come across relatively dry scientific papers written about potentially disastrous climate changes occurring at some point in this imprecisely defined point in the semi-distant future. And the IPCC has warned repeatedly that global temperatures could reach 5 degrees by the end of the century if we failed to curtail our greenhouse gas emissions. And this would probably commit the world to many meters of sea level rise, cause dramatic increases in severe weather events, potentially widespread loss of agricultural productivity, and could even cause temperatures in some parts of the world that exceed the limits of our physiological heat tolerance. One climate model even predicted that the Amazon forest could collapse later this century as a result of there not being enough rain to sustain the ecosystem that it depends on. Any of these things could be catastrophic for humanity and might even threaten our collective survival. But they also occur in a world in which we fail utterly to confront and deal with the causes of climate change. So the key to this question is actually this: how will humanity respond to the threat posed by global warming? As a scientific community, I would say we're actually pretty good at modeling the climate system and the many dynamics and feedbacks that occur amongst its components. We know very well that water vapor and snow are both powerful positive feedback mechanisms that will amplify the effects of our carbon dioxide emissions. We understand also how a warming climate will change the world around us, and we can point to recent events like the increasingly severe wildfire seasons in California and Australia, or to the occurrence of 200-year floods in 3 years here in Montreal, and we can identify the signature in these events of the 1 degree or so of temperature increase that we've caused over the past century. So overall, we can make pretty decent predictions of how the climate system will respond to our greenhouse gas emissions, but we're absolutely useless, I would say, at predicting how humanity will respond to the climate changes themselves. And this is, I think, where the biggest danger lies, not in the far-off possibility of catastrophic climate events or runaway sea level rise, but at the intersection of incremental climate changes and the dynamics of human societies and the ecosystems that we depend on. And this is also where our predictive ability is the weakest. So I'm not all that afraid of runaway climate changes leading to a hothouse Earth that is uninhabitable for humanity. My worry is that we live in and depend on a global economic system that may be far less resilient than we think it is, and that the system will start to break down as our climatic boundary conditions start to shift. And I worry that this could start to happen before we even see it coming. So many of the urgent social and environmental crises that we're facing today, poverty, food and water insecurity, biodiversity loss, global inequality, forced migration and displaced peoples, political polarization, all of these have the potential to be exacerbated by climate changes. A prolonged period of drought in Syria could have contributed to sparking the past 8 years of civil war and consequent refugee crisis. And so climate change can be a potent stressor on human and environmental systems that are already under considerable strain. And so my fear in all of this is that climate change could at some point be the last straw that makes something snap. And so dealing with global warming is really about minimizing the risk that climate change compound these other pressures and lead to societal instabilities that could have profound implications for everyone on the planet, beginning with those who are the least at fault and have the fewest resources available to protect themselves. What we're doing to the climate system really is unprecedented in the history of the Earth and demands an unprecedented response. And so how will we respond? Will humanity rally around the threat posed by global warming? Will we apply all of our considerable resources and creativity to the challenge of transforming our global economy and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say that we haven't done so yet by any stretch of the imagination. As the Arctic continues to melt, sometimes it seems that we are too busy fighting over who will get to extract the new oil that's becoming available to even pause to think about how ironic and indeed idiotic this dispute actually is. So how do we factor human responses into our climate change predictions, and not just our capacity for resilience and ingenuity, but also our capacity for individual and collective stupidity and irrationality? Our choices are what will determine whether climate change becomes a catastrophe, or whether we take this as an opportunity to reinvent and recreate our world as something more sustainable and more resilient. Because this door is still open. It is not too late to choose what sort of future we want to live in. But it will take a whole lot more effort from all of us to get there, and will require political leaders who are willing to find a way through the forces that would have us close our eyes while our house burns down around us. So we need to stop squabbling over what is feasible without compromising economic growth, and we need to start imagining what would be possible if we really tried to solve this problem. And so to everyone here tonight, find a way to help us rise to this challenge so that we never have to find out where humanity's breaking point actually is.
Good evening. I'm Devyani Saltzman. I'm currently fighting some microbes myself, so I have a glass of water and a little soft-spoken. We are at a tipping point, not only in terms of climate change, so eloquently spoken about in politics, but in culture as well. The shift from old stories to new stories, stories that have previously existed in the margins that are now becoming closer to the center. I'm thinking about the MoMA's recent rehang and the reframing of the artistic canon from perspectives that are often overlooked and voices that are often sidelined, to Ian Williams winning the Giller Prize 2 days ago. And when, yes, woot. And when we speak about survival and culture, I think of two things: the continued evolution of our shared narratives and the survival of artists, leaders, and change makers involved in pushing those narratives forward. There are many people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, having this conversation right now. Informal networks trying to survive the tipping point and facing the shared ceiling of colonial legacy and power together. I am one of those people. I've worked in the arts for 10 years as a child of a Punjabi immigrant and a Jewish Torontonian, first as the founding curator at Luminato, Toronto's Festival of Arts and Creativity, and then as the director of literature at the Banff Centre for the Arts, the first woman in the role in the center's 85-year history, and the first woman of color. I now work at the AGO, another colonial legacy institution, as the head of programming. It's the fourth largest museum in North America, and my job is overseeing an amazing group of curators who work in performance, talks, and film, specifically with the mandate of opening doors and welcoming people into a space that they often didn't see themselves in. When I was hired at Banff, the conversation around diversity and inclusion wasn't at front of mind as it is today. I was honored by the appointment at 27 and energized to see how one could shift and diversify programming to better reflect the voices of this country. Shifting institutions, especially from the inside out, is not easy, even when invited in. I had a vested interest. As a young journalist, I had never applied to their literary journalism program, which is quite esteemed. I had never, quote unquote, seen myself in that space, nor seen myself reflected in those that would be my teachers. When I arrived, I spent 3 years introducing new programs, an emerging writers program, the Center's first environmental writing program, and the Center's first investigative journalism program, with a self-described mandate to hire faculty of color and Indigenous faculty. As we just said, seeing oneself in a space and lowering barriers to access by creating fully scholarship programs is one of the most important things to the welcome I hadn't felt a decade earlier. This work takes resilience. Any type of longitudinal cultural shift does. What I discovered quickly, and once out of the first blush of energized naivete, was little matters to the BIPOC body doing this work around inclusion if change in those values aren't commonly shared and structurally built into the institution one is serving or those in the ultimate positions of power. And this is the rub. If there isn't alignment throughout an organization around the true value of inclusion and diversity of differently lived experiences, it will backslide. And it will wear you down in the process. Due to structural changes in leadership at Banff, I ended up, through a restructure, losing my team and a mentor who was dedicated to that change. She was not a woman of color. The work became harder and more isolated, and eventually my health started to fail. The end came when I was unable to support the center's first program dedicated specifically to BIPOC writers, the program closest to my heart that I had designed with faculty that included Griffin Prize-winning poet Liz Howard and David Cheriandy. I ended up in hospital, exhausted for 2 weeks, unable to stand. The cost of this work, as many in this room may know, especially if it is uphill, is ultimately one's own personal health. What is the point of this story? How does it relate to survival? I truly believe the survival of one's own person, one's own dignity, and the ultimate survival of healthy culture in Canada rests on increasingly ask the question, what is beyond that initial invitation and welcome? How can governance and leadership in legacy institutions truly be conscious and embody the values and understand the lived experience of BIPOC or differently abled folks? What I learned from my Banff experience is survival relies on knowing we are not alone. Upon returning to Toronto from the mountains and beginning to speak publicly about my experiences as a senior leader in culture, people began reaching out. I learned of networks from historically marginalized backgrounds forming networks to support each other. What was fascinating was there were so many, and they often shared the same common story: isolation within organizations where they were often one of a handful of people in senior management or artistic leadership. It was the 10% rule, the percentage of BIPOC folks when one walks into any established organization, any boardroom, or in that case, most any room in Canada. The key to survival and resilience was knowing one was not alone, and that collective awareness and collective action can lead to shifts in organizational thinking and culture. So what does it mean to create sustainable change? I will be honest, I don't know the answer to this, but I think about it often, almost every day, almost every minute. This is what I do know. To truly support and retain a new hire in my case, or anyone's case, or move beyond proudly announcing a person and having them act as a spokesperson, is to create a system of support in the workplace for those people. This means policy and training from the board level down. It means creative tactics for reaching that tipping point faster, without the load resting on the shoulders of a single person or a small group of people. Think cluster hiring. OCADU in Toronto demonstrated this beautifully recently when they did an Indigenous cluster hire, hiring over 5 faculty members, and now a POC cluster hire, meant to create a critical mass of senior BIPOC faculty and structural change. Most importantly, I believe it's always important to advocate for the freedom to speak of your experiences bravely and safely, despite difference in hierarchies of power. It's something the AGO and I are working on right now as part of a policy around rules of engagement within the workplace, and something I believe in deeply. You may wonder why this work is worth it, something I also ask myself. Broadcaster Jesse Wente advocates for working outside of our legacy cultural institutions and chose to leave the CBC and the Toronto Film Festival to start the Indigenous Screen Office. Why fight uphill? I feel there is deep merit to this and often consider starting my own cultural organization or working with other BIPOC folks to do the same. But for now, I still feel there is worth in pushing for change from the inside, especially as these spaces often have the platforms and budget to reach and potentially create transformative change for the most important constituents in this equation, our communities. Thank you.
All people, please welcome, please help me in thanking all of our talkers tonight. Vlada Stankovic, Samantha Roosh, B. Brett Finley. Very interested, Brett, in your relationship to hand sanitizer. Like, I'll ask you later, it's okay. Like, it just occurred to me. Thank you to Kieran O'Donnell. Thank you to Cherie Demeline. Thank you, Damon Matthews. Thank you, Devyani Saltzman. All of you. And Kieran, did I say Kieran O'Donnell? As Alan, Dr. Bernstein mentioned, we're thrilled that tonight is part of a 4-event series of events we're producing with CIFAR. So we are producing 2 upcoming ones, one in Calgary and one in New York City in the spring of 2020. So one on intelligence, one on exploration. So you can attend those talks. Come to New York with us, that's fun. Or you can watch them along with our over 800 other 7-minute talkers on our YouTube channel. Now, I want the audience, if you wouldn't mind sitting for a second, I'm going to ask the talkers in the front row to up, and Alan as well, please. You guys down the middle, you can clap them on out. They're going to get in the wine line first. Alan's right. You are all invited to the post-talks reception. We call it the speaker petting zoo. So you actually will be able to talk to all of them. To further support these important Canadian conversations, please consider subscribing to the Walrus magazine. Those people who put up their hand earlier, you know, my favorite people, they subscribe to the magazine. You can do that tonight at our table back there for just $25 for an entire year. I practically deliver it to your house myself. Fake news is cheap. It's really, really cheap. Last week I got an email from what I considered a very trustworthy source that it told me that Alice Munro had died, our beloved Alice. And I went to tell the editorial and digital team because, of course, it's a big deal and Alice has written for us and she's a great Canadian. Within 30 seconds, our editorial and digital team came back to me and said it was fake news. That it looked like it was from McClelland and Stewart, which is Alice's publisher. It had a quote in it from her daughter, naming her daughter properly. Like, it looked really real, and it wasn't real, it was a hoax. So at the Walrus, we have live human fact checkers. They need to be paid. And we don't think this is a luxury. So please consider joining our community of more than 2,000 donors across the country who also support fact-based journalism, independent fact-based journalism. Tonight, also incredible, we have a matching donor, dollar for dollar. Anything actually that is donated to the Walrus between now and the end of December will be matched dollar for dollar. So if it's $10, it's 20. If it's $100, it's $200. If it's $50,000, it's $100,000. Just saying, you can do the math. So subscribing and donating is very important. And if you're at our table back there, you can meet the Walrus team. Tina, Shema, Andrea, and Kaylin would love to meet you. Or you can just hand me your credit card. I'm wearing this suit. Very hard to miss me in this suit. You can also you can also purchase Cherie's and Brent's book at our table, and they are willing to sign them should you wish them to do so. You can also sign up for our newsletter. That doesn't cost a penny. And then you won't miss any Walrus talks in future. Thank you to Alan Bernstein, Catherine Riddell, Marta Hopes, Rachel Parker, Jackie Sullivan, and everyone at CIFAR for your partnership. And please also be sure to visit CIFAR's booth during the reception. You can also sign up for their newsletters, and they also have a magazine called Reach. I'd like to thank our national partners who go with us everywhere: Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Air Canada, and Shaw. And when you join us at the reception, there is food, there is drink, and there is also Adventure Canada, our partners. You can sign up at their table to win a once-in-a-lifetime trip from Resolute Bay, Nunavut to Greenland. I'm unclear whether you come back. I think you do, but you can enter to win that trip at the Adventure Canada table. And if you're at the reception, there will also be good conversation. I want you to remember one more thing. We're not actually the Walrus. You're the Walrus. You are the Walrus. Thank you for coming. Good night. Miigwech.